When you're sitting on the front porch at night and you're looking, which we love to do, and especially in contrast to Dallas, and the street lights are on, and you sense two things: extraordinary compassion and extraordinary precariousness. That's an ecstatic kind of thing. It's very lovely. It's very strange. And there's a precariousness here in these small towns, especially in the flatness of Texas, that easily supports the construction of metaphor, construction of various meanings. It is eloquent, and it presents the possibility of the imposition of ideas upon it.
As the new century arrived in Corsicana on January 1st, 1901, change was not only in the wind, it was 1,000 to 1,500 feet beneath the ground. And however life would be altered in the decades ahead, it was already certain that the 20th century was going to be noisier than the last. The future of Corsicana never seemed brighter than in the opening days of the new century, as the clank of noisy machinery pulled from the ground the 20th century as fast as it could pump it. The hydrocarbon that would ignite unimaginable changes in the decades ahead. But whatever the promises of the incoming century, the other, ushered out as history, rarely departs without leaving behind something upended.
I think one of the things that began to steer in a negative direction when you got up to the 1890s was with the coming of the strong industrialization, especially of the oil industry. Many outside influences were coming into Corsicana, a town that had been pretty well set by a lot of families that had been there for a long time, many generations. Suddenly, people from the outside were coming in. It became more cosmopolitan, much more so than that little town was ready to accept. And I think it spilled over into a lot of other areas, especially when it came to some areas of racial tension, when it came to just areas of people from the outside coming in, beginning to influence what Corsicana should be and where it should go, whereas some of the people in town, I think, began to resent some of that or be afraid of some of that.
Those for whom these years were everyday life long ago took their versions with them to their final residences in local cemeteries or to their rest in graveyards far away. This is their story and the story of their city, Corsicana, Texas, during the transformative decades that bridged 2 centuries. It is a story of ancestry, of our civic forebears, and there's sometimes conflicts of conscience and differences of judgment. It is, most of all, the story of a city that on more than one occasion found in its public schools the causes of civic identity. On a warm day in the first week of March, 1901, Mrs. J.B. Sherwood, art critic, lecturer, reformer, and friend to the progressive causes of women, arrived at Corsicana's Union Depot. In her day, Jean Sherwood was a luminary. Next to the pioneer political activist and suffragette, Jane Addams, she was said to be the most beloved lady in Chicago. Mrs. Sherwood had begun touring Texas in 1900. It was one of her many philanthropic projects meant to support not only local interest in art, but also to strengthen the new women's club movement, the opening act in a drama that would in time help to change profoundly the role of women in American society. As she stood on the platform at Union Depot, waiting for porters to gather her luggage, Jean Sherwood had no way of knowing that she had arrived at a city in crisis, where restiveness was palpable and reflections on art could take hold only of the most determined imaginations. Since the last fading light of 1900, Corsicana had been rife with dark murmurings. After the murder of a young wife, Emma French, on a farm in nearby Barry, bludgeoned to death with the barrel of a rifle by her husband's employee, Anderson Norris. The crime so stirred passions that when Norris was brought to the Navarre County Courthouse for his examining trial, only the intervention of the Garrity Rifles, the local volunteer militia, prevented an aroused citizenry from seizing him from the courtroom. Then, in the late afternoon of Wednesday, March 6th, as the mild temperatures of a teasing spring gave way to the last harsh breath of winter, Corsicana lost its mind. 3 months removed from an outrage in the last December of a departed century, it happened again. Another young wife, another brutal murder.
I've passed down the line of life for 60 years, accepting life as I have found it. Passed through a war of courage and death, and trouble at my own fireside. Death is unavoiding. But the scene I witnessed last night at the inquest of Mrs. Younger, who had been murdered by someone my vocabulary of language is not sufficient to describe.
Late in the afternoon, a few miles north of Corsicana, in an area known as the Chambers Creek neighborhood, not far from the Houston and Texas Central tracks, a large man approached 22-year-old Valley Dale Younger, alone at the Younger farm with her 3-year-old daughter, her namesake, and her 1-year-old son, Willie. Several hours later, as Captain H.E. Dale was returning from town, the horse drawing his wagon shied as it approached the Youngers' farm. Captain Dale calmed the animal and climbed down from the wagon to investigate. What he found was wrenching. His daughter's body lay at the side of the road, face up, covered in blood. Inside the Younger house, in the wreck of a desperate and violent struggle, he found his grandchildren locked in a room. 3-year-old Valley so traumatized, it took some time for her to speak a single clue to the murderer's identity. At the inquest held later that evening, the cause of death was officially determined. Valley Dale, wife of Conway Younger, had been stabbed multiple times. Some wounds penetrated deep into her chest. Her jugular vein had been severed. A peculiar, insulting slash laid open her left cheek.
I am opposed to mob violence. People have a misunderstanding as to mob law. Where a person is taken and killed without a cause is mob violence. What is law? Law is the people, and the law is nothing but a creation of the people. Suppose I should assassinate one of my neighbor's wives or daughters. I should, if proved to be the right person, be hung at the first tree or telephone post. Is that mob law? I say no. It would be enforcing the law in short order. The time has come that our people be protected. I find the men through the country are uneasy. When they leave home on business, they think that perhaps when they return, they will find their wives or daughters assassinated. I ask the men, white and black, to say with actions and words that these things must stop, that the women and children shall be safe in this country.
While the bloodhounds brought from Hillsboro were losing the scent as they pushed east toward Powell, a city policeman arrested John Henderson in the south yards of the Houston and Texas Central Railroad about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Henderson was an itinerant, an ex-convict with a known alias, bright eyes that hinted at a penchant for thievery. When taken into custody, he had been begging among railroad workers, wearing an ill-fitting suit stolen the previous afternoon in the same neighborhood as the Younger farm. Sheriff Wiley Robinson ordered Henderson hid in a railroad outhouse until he could be hidden again under mail sacks on a westbound cotton belt and safely transferred to a jail outside the county. It was the last effective action Robinson would be allowed to take in the service of his oath of office. On the second floor at 210 West Collins Street, the city editor of the Corsicana Morning Times sat down at his desk to type copy for Friday's paper. He chose words resonant with deeply felt Southern imperatives.
The crime was a most heinous and damnable one, and the Times does not hesitate to say that the world would have been richer and hell itself poorer if Norris and Henderson had expiated their crimes at the same stake yesterday. And the longer they are afforded the opportunity to die natural deaths, the stigma of their being allowed to live in a land where so many noble mothers and pure daughters abound in all their Southern chastity and devotion to home and country will become even more shameful than it already is. Corsicana Morning Times, March 8, 1901.
You look at the census records of the people who came to Corsicana in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, and they came from the Old South. They came from Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee and the Carolinas, and they brought with them the culture of the Old South. They brought their slaves with them. They brought their political attitudes and their racial attitudes.
On the night of March 12th, a well-organized plan was put into effect that would bring Jonas John Henderson, accused murderer of Valleydale Younger, into the control of an extrajudicial process and the vengeful intentions of a mob. As the northbound Katy approached Itasca, a group of well-dressed men who had boarded the train at Hillsborough, armed and confidently unmasked, seized control of the prisoner as he was being moved to Fort Worth, and of the two officers who were escorting him, Deputy Mish Hammonds and Constable W.B. Grantham. By morning's light, Henderson was in the Navarre County Jail. Still shivering from fright in a cold night's wagon ride, John Henderson confessed, not to Sheriff Robinson, but to a hastily assembled collection of citizen investigators. He gave no motive, and he confessed to no crime other than murder. This was as much due process as John Henderson would receive under mob law.
As much as a gruesome travesty as the Henderson lynching was, it's not out of the ordinary for people of all ages to be brought in and participate in watching an execution, just or unjust, gruesome or not gruesome. Capital punishment was a lesson. It was a lesson in civics.
Outside the jail, drawn by rumor and expectation, a crowd began to assemble in the early morning sun. Among them was a photographer who climbed the stairs to the northwest pavilion of the courthouse. From this position of advantage, his camera framed the widest foreground and the deepest depth of field. The first photograph of the spectacle of John Henderson's lynching captured a pair of windows, open and receptive to the morning's air. The building, with its unobstructed line of sight to the courthouse a block away, is Corsicana High School.
What lessons do you try to convey to students in that kind of environment? In this situation where your motive and your purpose is to educate and elevate and to make people better people because of being educated.
If I'm looking out that window, what's my role in it? Like I'm looking out that window and say, and really honestly ask myself the question, am I going to be one who perpetuates the fear, the hate, whatever, or am I going to perpetuate love and introduce forgiveness and all kinds of other radical concepts into that scene?
Those who were there gathered casually, even orderly as it seemed to some, showing among themselves no sign of a mob's inflammation. But 2 blocks away, in a large room on the second floor at City Hall, called Fireman's Hall, emotions turned impatient and threatening. 25 prominent members of the city and county, acting together as a committee, cut short their deliberations on Henderson's crime and punishment and raced back to the county jail. Shortly before 11 o'clock, John Henderson was rushed from the jail across the street to the courthouse lawn. The rumor of an approaching militia from Dallas, ordered to the city by the governor, had brought both urgency and defiance. The figure of Sheriff Robinson watches passively in front of his jail, having ceased to be relevant in the case against John Henderson.
I was told by a person who claimed to have actually been there, a man who 104 years old, who at the time would have been a student in that school, that he was let out with all the other students and they were actually taken down to the lynching site and lined up to watch.
What comes in those windows is so vast, it's part of the weather. That the windows are open, like you open windows in those days. You open the windows onto the weather, and you're opening it onto weather in some sense. That this unimaginable event constitutes a kind of weather. They're open casually. That it's that easy, that it's that casual, that it's that open. Of course it's terrifying, it's terrifying.
You know that once they heard the noise they were watching, what was going on, it did one of two things, didn't it? It either entrenched some very terrible opinions, or it put people on the path of saying, this can never happen in our midst again.
There's a lot of anger and a lot of bitterness and a lot of resentment. There had been legislation passed to deny people who had supported the Confederacy citizenship. You had to go through a process to regain your status, and new laws had been passed enabling former slaves to vote and to participate in the process. And so there's anger there.
Despite the anti-lynching statute, despite long dissertations against mob rule, despite the tireless actions of the civil authorities, despite the watchfulness of the state's executive office, the unwritten law, one of the priceless heritages of the Anglo-Saxon race, and which commands that none shall lay forceful hands on the body of a woman, has been swiftly and awfully enforced. An unidentified citizen, Dallas Daily Times Herald, March 14, 1901.
In 1901, 105 Black Americans are known to have been lynched in the United States. How many of these instances occurred in a torment of fire on a courthouse lawn, beneath the open windows of a public school, is not known. On the Friday after Henderson's burning, A.W. Hartman, editor of the Corsicana Daily Sun, was asked by a Dallas reporter to give an account of the mob's actions in Corsicana.
The state of affairs which brought about this thing is caused by the decision of the Court of Criminal Appeals. Now, this court has recently reversed cases where Negroes who were found guilty for the reason that there were no Negroes on the grand or petit juries. The people feel that under this decision there is no hope of justice being dealt to such Negroes, and they have come to the conclusion that the Negroes cannot be convicted, and they will have to take justice into their own hands. Most people in Corsicana were glad there was no militia or rangers there to resist the crowd. If there had been, there certainly would have been serious trouble. There were 20 men present who would have led the crowd against a regiment of regulars, and there were 1,000 who would have followed them. The mob at Corsicana, if it can be called a mob, was comprised of the best citizens and property owners of Navarre County. They were perfectly orderly, and no judicial execution was ever carried out more seriously.
On the same day as Hartman's interview with the Dallas Morning News, Harry Burton, himself a newspaper man, a congenial, well-liked Virginian, who had entertained his fellow veterans at the 1899 reunion of Parsons' Brigade with his rousing version of "I'm a Good Old Rebel," took up his pen and wrote a personal note to the governor in Austin.
March 15, 1901. Honorable J.D. Sayers, Governor, Austin, Texas. My dear Governor, as a lover of law and order, and as an officer of the state and county, I beg to submit the enclosed clippings from our daily papers to show how officers and papers can excite people to lawlessness by imprudence and desire to gain popularity with the masses. Our sheriff and county attorney did all that was possible for them to do under the trying circumstances, and the people are uttering all manner of abuse upon them for their efforts to protect the Negro from the mob, while the officer who has done most to encourage mob law is receiving letters from lawbreakers applauding his verdict. Verdict was rendered while the Negro was burning. He was dead, but still burning. I could have held the inquest, but refused to do so upon the request of one of the lynchers. I am not prompted to write this by any other than a desire to put blame where it belonged. H.W. Burton, Justice of the Peace, Precinct No. 1.
Henderson's burning was the work of Southern men, most of them honorable and esteemed within their communities. Among them was an officer of the law, a member of the 20th Texas Legislature, a prominent civic leader, former police commissioner and merchant, a lawyer soon to become the city's mayor, and a future president of the school board. All men of character, committed to the service of their city. But they had not lost their belief in the terror of flames to intimidate, or surrendered their willingness to use it to preserve what they held inviolable. Others in the city, whose names are absent from public records, understood that lynch law threatens the safety of all Americans, as well as another inviolable conviction: the promise that no citizen, even the guilty, should have to fear expedited justice in the throes of inflamed reason or dark passions, in an awful parody of justice. Through the remaining days of March, the curious kicked at Henderson's ashes and collected such relics as were left on the courthouse lawn, and read Culberson's anti-lynching law with fresh interest, and waited. In the temperate air of April, among the greening of trees, Corsicana's incendiary mood extinguished, and the city returned to earlier preoccupations undisturbed. Except in quarters where quiet recalculations were being considered of the world that children should see through their schoolhouse windows, and, for that matter, of what a schoolhouse might say about a city.
Though I saw it all around, I never thought that I could be affected. I was taught to fight, taught to win. I am a man whose dreams have all deserted.
Don't give up, you're not the only one.
It is so strange the way things turn.